So originally, I was going to talk about specific differences between dialects of Middle English. However, I decided that me explaining to you what's in that chapter on dialect differences in Middle English was not going to make that content any clearer or more interesting than you will already find it to be in the textbook Van Gelderen's A History of the English Language. And so, what I'm going to talk about is something that she doesn't talk about that much in that book, which is among those dialects, which included Northern and East Midlands and Kentish and Southern and West Midlands. Those are the five basic dialects of Middle English, so there is a continuum. Why is it that East Midlands emerged as the standard, the basis of written English, and the basis of modern international English? We're going to talk a little bit about the events and factors in the late medieval period that resulted in that. And one of those factors is the script that you're looking at right here, which is a letter produced in the Chancery Hand, about which more in a few slides from now. Let's just briefly, I'm not going to go into the specific details of each of these texts, but I'll talk, of each of these dialects, but I'll talk a little bit about them. The northern dialect, spoken way up in northern England, getting close to Scotland, north of the Humber River, what was in the Old English period known as Northumbria, is closer to Scots, and it is actually, in many ways, closer to Old English than other dialects of Middle English will be. It also continues to have large features of Old Norse in it, and includes a number of details that will disappear, or not disappear, but will take over Southern English later on. One of these, of course, we've already talked about, is the emergence of the pronoun they, them over he or him. Another one, or he, him. Another one is the third person singular in S. He walks, is going to take over gradually by 1700. It's a long process, but he walks is going to replace the southern version of the third person singular, he walketh, right? And in fact, Chaucer, in the Reeves Tale, in the Canterbury Tales, produces a version of Northern Middle English as spoken by these two students. That is actually the first representation of a dialect, what in literature is called I dialect, in a medieval or in an English text, especially an English literary text. So it's kind of interesting for that details. And it's got some things that are ahead, so to speak, of Middle English, like the third person singular walks, but it's got some things that are older, like saying swa instead of so. We talked in the episode on medieval sounds about how that W in a lot of words, swa becomes swo, swilk becomes such. That W disappears, but it hasn't disappeared in the northern dialect yet. So there's the northern dialect, the East Midlands dialect, which I'll come back to, Kentish, spoken in the southeast, which has some features which, interestingly enough, are closer to Dutch and Frisian than other dialects of Middle English. Like, for example, a lot of times in Southern Middle English, the consonant S, when it's devoiced at the beginning of a word, like in sounds or signs, will be voiced. So they'll pronounce it zounds and zines. And then there's West Midlands, which is its own whole bag of features, and that I'm not going to get into right now. Although West Midlands is probably the second most well-known dialect of Middle English after East Midlands, because a number of important literary texts were written in it. A lot of the monarchs of in the 1300s, in the Plantagenet dynasty, had held their kind of country court. They're outside of the city court. They had a major center power in their personal holdings of Cheshire in the West Midlands, where they went to hunt and hold court and spend Christmas and stuff like that. And so a lot of literary texts like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight are written in the West Midlands dialect, and a number of romances are as well. So yeah, those are your 5 dialects of Middle English. Northern, spoken up north. East Midlands, which is spoken in the East Midlands. Kentish in the southeast, that kind of peninsula that goes off into a corner in the southeast of England. Southern, which goes off towards the southwest, in the southwest of England, towards Cornwall. And then the West Midlands, which is up sort of in the border country between Wales and England. And in the west part of England, really. Herefordshire, other places like that. Standardization. This is a concept that is going to be important in the remaining weeks of this class. This is a big kind of theme of this class, is how standard English emerged and why other non-standard Englishes survived. What does standardization mean? What are the factors that cause standardization? What are the factors that make some groups resist speaking or using a standardized language? Well, standardization is a process or a pressure that results from a language prestige. It's a kind of imposition on a language of of prescriptivism. What is the language supposed to look like? How is it supposed to work? With standardization, you get the emergence of the idea of right and wrong forms. The right forms are the standard, and the wrong forms are a non-standard, which become, in the minds of people, a substandard. So what gives a variety prestige? I'm using the term variety here in a specific technical sociolinguistic sense. A variety is a specific form of a language or language cluster. This may include languages, dialects, registers, styles, or other forms of language, as well as a standard variety. So variety is a kind of a broad term, but it's usefully broad, because a variety we can kind of have zoomed out and talk about variety as an entire dialect of a language, or we could zoom in and talk about variety as, English is spoken by working class people in the upland South, right? So variety is nicely flexible term or label to put on a way that people speak, a language or a language cluster. Use of the word variety avoids the use of the term language, which many people associate with a standard language, like a national language, French or Russian or Mandarin Chinese. And it also avoids using the term dialect, which is often associated, rightly or wrongly, with non-standard varieties, thought of as less prestigious or correct than the standard. And dialects are also often associated with non-literate forms, right? Official languages, standardized languages, often goes hand in hand with writing. So, with that in mind, what are some of the factors that contribute to resistance against language standardization? This is a question we're going to ask as we go forward too. Now, though, I want briefly to talk about what the factors were for the emergence of East Midlands as a standard. The East Midlands are the area sort of north of the Thames, north of London, getting into Anglia, the area known as Anglia. The factors, I'm going to explain all of these. The Chancery hand, printing, the London-Oxford-Cambridge triangle, a mixed dialect, and a happy mean. My source for this content is a wonderful website here, which is linked here on the history of standardization, which is a nice supplement to Van Gelderen's textbook, which does not get into this so much. So first of all, what is the Chancery hand? By hand here, we mean handwriting. And handwriting in the Middle Ages is not a very personal kind of fluid thing. Handwritings were taught as a kind of shop style. To be a scribe, you were, originally in a monastery and later in commercial scribes or in government offices, you were taught to write in a very specific and exact and particular way that was kind of impersonal. Now, there are people called paleographers who are experts on ancient writing and ancient writing systems. And medieval paleographers, who are really good, can locate, can see documents or books and connect them to specific places, times, even specific scribes based on their style. But basically, everyone who worked in the same shop or place would try to, or university would try to share a similar kind of writing. The chancery hand was the form of writing that was used by people who worked in the court, um, the chancery court in the city of Westminster. The city of Westminster was 2 miles from London at the time. Nowadays, it's like practically right in the middle of London. The city of London in the Middle Ages was just what's now called the city, which is the kind of financial district that's north of the river, before it goes west, before it goes west and bends south, and then on the west side of the river is where Westminster is. That's where Parliament is. And Big Ben and the House of Parliament, and across from the river is the Millennium Wheel. I'm imagining the introduction to Sherlock now. Anyway, the city of Westminster was the center of government administration. The Chancery was the court of the Lord Chancellor, which produced many, many documents written in English rather than French that had to do with real estate law, family law, settlements, all kinds of documents. And so it's the way its spelling system and the way that it wrote things and the way that it used language was based on the East Midlands dialect. And because these government documents were disseminated all through England, it became part of a model of like, this is official language. This is the language that people in power use. And when there's a variety that's attached to power, that power itself gives language the kind of prestige that helps make it become a standard. Another factor for the East Midlands as standard, and this is a closely associated one, was the introduction of printing in London. The late Middle Ages marks the beginning of the printing press. It was introduced into continental Europe in 1453-ish, I think, and the first English printed book was brought over from the Low Countries by William Caxton, who first printed a book in England in 1473. He based the way that he formatted, spelled, and edited texts in English on the standard that was already established by the Court of the Chancery, because he set up his printing press right there in Westminster, quarter of a mile away from the Court of the Chancery. So he was influenced by that influential model and also by just the general dialect of East Midlands that was spoken around that area. And then once he started printing out books, the influence of the selected variety of East Midlands was accelerated by the copies of texts that were newly made available more easily and at lower cost. The printing was a pretty important revolution in terms of the fact that you didn't have to hand copy every text anymore. You set up the printing plates once, and then you could just crank them out, right? Another factor, this is a significant factor as well, as real estate agents say, location, 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 right? Another factor for the East Midlands as the standard was the London, Oxford, Cambridge triangle, as it's called. Oxford and Cambridge are only about 60 miles from London. Students from all over England mixed in these two universities. London, as the capital, also had a mixed population. People from everywhere else in England came there. In this influential triangle, a lot of East Midlands speech could be heard. So if you came from one of the extreme ends of England, you would accommodate your speech more to the language of shopkeepers, of your landlords, of the people that you had to deal with every day, the townies, you might say, who were serving students or government officials or newly arrived laborers or something like that. And so East Midlands becomes a lingua franca, a common language among a group of English people who are more mobile than others. Bearing in mind that throughout the Middle Ages and well into the modern period, most people never travel beyond their own home village more than 10 or 20 miles in their entire life, right? And this, of course, causes the intensification of differences in varieties between regions. But they all get a little blended together here in the East Midlands, with the East Midlands dialect itself being the kind of substrate, right? And so the triangle represents the center of learning and government, but also the arts and commerce. This is where merchants set up shop. This is where the major traders have their bases, and this is where, later on, Shakespeare is going to come from Stamford, which is up near Birmingham, which is as far from London as Springfield, Missouri is from St. Louis, right? Which it would have been like a day's ride on a horse, not a 3 or 4 hour drive in a car. As Shakespeare came all the way down to London, because that's where the action was, that's where the art scene was, that's where one would go for fame and recognition. So where do people go? They go to the city. There was a wonderful expression in the Middle Ages in German, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free. And if indeed, when you went into the city, if you were able to stay there and establish residency, you'd be freed from any servile bonds you might have had to a landlord as a bonded farmer, as a serf or something like that. Other factors for the East Midlands as standard connect to these other things. East Midland was a mixed dialect, in part because it was in between all the other places. And the way dialects often work, as dialectologists have studied, is you can go from one town to the next walking, and each town is a little bit different, and features change until you get to a place where finally you're speaking a different language. And this is far more common in the Middle Ages now than it is now with national borders. So for this reason, East Midlands dialect would have had features in common with the other features that surrounded it. And so it was also geographically central. This is what we mean by it's a happy mean. It was spoken not in the extreme north or the south, and people would have had more contact with it probably. So these are all the reasons that kind of determined why this particular variety became the standard English language rather than others. It's important to remember that some languages become standards and prestige varieties not because of any inherent superiority of those languages to any others, but because of historical accident, right? English is not the most commonly learned second language in the world because it's such a great and wonderful language that everybody wants to learn it. It's because we have the biggest English speakers, and the countries with English speakers have the most money and the biggest bombs. Anyway, let's just an example of how these dialects live on, despite the fact that they're not commonly found in literature. In Shakespeare's King Lear, he gives us an example of Southern dialect, of what literary studies, again, is called I dialect, in the character of Edgar, who's, I think, somebody pretending to be somebody. Yeah, it's the courtier of Lear, who's pretending to be somebody else. Let go, slave, or thou diest. Good gentleman, go your gait, and let poor Volk pass, and should have been swaggered out of my life. 'Twould not have been so long as 'tis by a fortnight. Nay, come not near the old man, keep out. Javor ye, or I'se try whether your costard or my ballow be the harder. Chai will be plain with you. Out, dunghill! Chai will pick your teeth, sir. Come, no matter for your voins. Now, okay, that was hard to understand for me as I was reading it, but imagine it would have been hilarious to audiences in Shakespeare's time who are like, listen to the guy talk funny like people down in Dover or whatever, I don't know. Some of these features of Southern dialect that survive from Middle English is the V for F, Volk for folk, fortnight for fortnight, and Vor for four, also z for s, zo for so, zur for sir, zwagged for s. Should for I would, remembering that I comes from the Old English each, and in Middle English this was e or each or each. So should is a contraction of each would. Some of these sound changes are sound changes that happen in other Germanic languages, like I was saying in Frisian. Anyway, that's it. That's our presentation on Middle English dialects and why East Midlands emerged as a standard. I hope you found this interesting. I think this is interesting. I really quite like the sociolinguistic aspect of historical language study. You all have a great weekend. And I don't know when you're watching this already, but have a great weekend. Bye.